Hello, everyone. Welcome to AP Overstimulated. Today, we're covering AP Government, Topic 1.2. So let's begin. In the last video, we covered the foundations of our government and the political ideals that compose our democracy. For this topic, we're going to analyze our democracy further and focus on the different kinds of democracy that interact within the political landscape of the United States. There are three main types of democracy that you need to know: participatory democracy, pluralist democracy, and elite democracy. Participatory democracy describes a system in which every political decision involves direct participation from the people. So, if our nation were completely participatory, we would be voting on every single proposed bill, resolution, motion, or really any political decision that passes through Congress in our current system. As you can imagine, the Founding Fathers saw this model of democracy as unrealistic and impractical. However, that doesn't mean they excluded the opportunity for participatory democracy from all aspects of American politics. For example, the Constitution grants states the power to implement the participatory model into some elements of their politics. Some states rely on the entire voting population to determine state law and policy. On a smaller scale, certain towns implement town hall meetings to establish local policy, and institutions like city councils and school districts use the participatory model. So, while the Founding Fathers found the participatory model impractical at the federal level, they gave way for states and cities to apply it at a smaller scale. Two more examples of participatory democracy are referendums and initiatives. Referendums allow citizens to petition against a decision from state or local legislature, appealing to get it overturned. Initiative grants citizens the opportunity to get a proposed measure put on a ballot for a vote. So, if enough people in Kentucky want Friday to be considered Kentucky Pizza for Lunch Day, they can file for an initiative to get it put on a state ballot. Both of these models provide citizens with an opportunity to get directly involved in state and local politics, preventing the elite from neglecting the needs of the general populace. The next model of democracy is pluralist democracy. Pluralist democracy describes a political system that is affected by the interactions between interest groups. Interest groups are just what they sound like: groups of people bound together by a certain interest. For example, a climate change activism group or a pro-gun organization would both be considered interest groups. So, in pluralist democracy, these interest groups would compete to have their interests represented in politics by negotiating with policymakers. However, the Founding Fathers knew how easily this system could dominate politics. If all the power was in the hands of interest groups, certain interest groups could monopolize Congress, and the needs of less significant groups would go ignored. So, they modeled the U.S. government in such a way that prevented this from happening. For example, Congress has representatives from each state in both chambers. In this case, each state is an interest group that represents the interests of their state. However, since there are so many different representatives and competing interests, it is essentially impossible for one interest to dominate. Finally, let's talk about elitist democracy. In elitist democracy, only an elected few, typically those of a higher economic and social status, make all the decisions in government on behalf of the general populace. Now, the Founding Fathers really liked this one, applying it to all three branches of the government. They liked it so much because it wasn't only efficient, but it ensured the most educated and well-adjusted individuals were in control of national policy. In fact, they loved elitist democracy so much that they initially had the Senate elected by state legislatures. This would be later changed by the 17th Amendment in 1913, but it demonstrates how much elitist democracy was initially present in our nation. While the Founding Fathers loved elitist democracy, they did make some concessions. They acknowledged that if the elite are the only ones making decisions, the needs of those in a lower social class or standing in society will be ignored. So, they made space for the other two forms of democracy to be utilized. Okay, now that we've covered the three forms of democracy, let's talk about how they were fiercely debated leading up to the ratification of the Constitution. While the Constitution mostly champions elitist democracy, this was cause for contention leading up to its ratification. You see, before the Constitution was ratified, there were two main groups who feuded over its content. They were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were all on board with the Constitution in its proposed state. They were big old proponents of elitist democracy and a strong central government, meaning they wanted more power to the federal government, less power to the states. On the Federalist team was Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and John Jay, who got together to write a series of 85 essays explaining why they were right and the Anti-Federalists were wrong. One of their most significant Federalist papers, and a required document for AP Gov, was Federalist 10, which explained why any fear over any one interest group dominating politics was unjustified. Madison, who wrote the paper, claimed that the diverse scheme of American politics, where so many different interest groups are competing, would prevent any one group from taking over. In the other corner, you had the Anti-Federalists, who also had a pretty stocked roster containing political figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. While the Anti-Federalists weren't directly opposed to the Constitution, they were concerned that, in such an elitist system with so many significant interest groups, the needs of the lower classes and less powerful interest groups would be ignored. They wrote about their grievances in the required document Brutus I, which was most likely written by politician Robert Yates, but since the author went under the pseudonym Brutus, their identity remains uncertain. All right, that's it for Topic 1.2 of AP Gov. I hope you have a scrumptious rest of your day. Bye-bye.